Thank you for gathering here today with Amir of K2 Integrity to discuss a critical aspect of international trade and security and the sanctions circumvention. As we navigate an increasingly complex global landscape, it's essential that we understand the risks associated with evading sanctions and take proactive measures to prevent such behavior. As we all know, the sanctions are powerful tools used by the governments and the international bodies to exert economic and political pressure on specific countries, entities, individuals. And the sanctions lists are comprehensive databases that identify individuals, companies, and the countries subject to specific restrictions. These lists vary based on the issuing authority, for example, the United Nations, the European Union, or another nation, and the entities must understand the scope of each list to ensure the compliance. Entities should be vigilant in avoiding circumvention risks regardless of the nature of the listing. And I would like to explain you a few key steps to consider. The number one is, of course, to know your customer and the due diligence and the risk assessment. You should definitely know your customer. And when trading with the third countries, EU operators must conduct due diligence to verify their business partners' compliance with the sanctions. And the rigorous know your customer process help identify potential risks. You should do strategic risk assessments, and the operators should assess their exposure to sanctions circumvention schemes. This involves mapping out goods, services, and activities at risk, especially those in high demand in targeted countries. And we need to be careful about the red flags and the enhanced due diligence. And we need to identify the red flags, and the entities should be alert to red flags that indicate potential sanctions evasions, which may include the unusual payment methods, frequent change in shipping routes, inconsistent pricing, or trade discrepancies. Then everyone needs to understand the enhanced due diligence. So for high-risk situations, the operators should implement enhanced due diligence. This involves assessing the business partners, transactions, and the goods more thoroughly. As you know, the facilitators or the circumvention must also be red flagged, and the entities should not only focus on the direct violators, but also identify facilitators of the circumventions. These intermediaries play a crucial role in evading sanctions. By flagging them, we can disrupt the networks that enable illicit activities. And finally, I can say that the understanding the end use of export control items is vital. Entities must ensure that their products do not indirectly support sanctions activities. Robust end-use monitoring prevents unintended contributions to harmful endeavors. Now, there is also the technology that will help us to ensure the screening methodologies like AI. If you talk about the AI technologies such as natural language processing and machine learning can significantly improve sanctions screening processes. AI can automate the process of screening transactions, customers, and partners against sanctions lists. By doing so, it reduces the risk of human error and ensures the consistent compliance. Traditional screening methods often generate false positives, leading to unnecessary investigations, and the AI algorithms can refine matching criteria, minimizing false alarms while maintaining the accuracy. AI can also identify intricate patterns and networks associated with sanctions evasion. It goes beyond the simple matching, allowing institutions to detect sophisticated schemes. So, Amir, thank you for joining us today. I would like you to kindly introduce yourself first, then I will raise some questions for your business and the professionalism.
Awesome. Thank you, Shafat. It's great to be here. My name is Amir Fadavi. I'm a senior director at K2 Integrity, an advisory consultancy firm I am based in DC. Our offices are in New York, London, Abu Dhabi, everywhere. So what we do is a lot of sanctions work. I am myself 100% focused on export control and sanctions. And as a lot of you know, there's no shortage of sanction and export control questions these days. So I'm happy to be here with Herden Law Firm. We had the opportunity to be in Istanbul a couple of weeks ago with the State Department talking about sanctions, and we met Herdem Law Firm, and very glad to be here and talking about sanction lists.
Thank you very much, Amir. I want to ask you a question. We'll start with a question. So what are the key challenges in deciphering the sanctions lists for you?
That's a great one. So all of it is a challenge right now because we have so many different lists. Like, let's take a step back. Let's talk about type of sanctions and see where sanction lists come into play. We have list-based sanctions and we have non-list-based sanctions. Non-list-based sanctions, for example, are these comprehensive sanctions that are imposed against an entire jurisdiction. For example, Iran sanctions imposed by the US against Iran, North Korea, Syria, and Cuba. These are not necessarily part of those programs are not list-based. However, there are list-based sanctions, which is kind of the targeted sanction. So instead of imposing sanction against an entire country, the sanction imposing authority comes and say, we want to go targeted to limit the damage around the, to avoid imposing costs on people who are not targets of sanctions. So that's the mindset behind that. How do you do that? The sanction imposing authorities publish these lists and say, okay, whoever is mentioned in this list is targeted by our sanctions. I wish it was that easy. There was one list, whoever was that on list, sanctioned, and everyone knew about it. But the challenge is there are many different types of lists. First of all, let's think about different sanction imposing authorities. We have UN, we have EU, we have UK, we have US, we have Turkey. There are different sanction imposing authorities that have their own sanction lists. And I think in the past few years, we've seen the proliferation of these lists by different authorities. Like Canada now has, Australia has, Singapore has, South Korea has, like every country has their own list now. And sometimes when I work with list providers, they just provide so many lists and I see clients get so confused. What are all these lists? What am I supposed to do with them? But here, I'm just gonna focus on the US side for a sec. Because I'm a US lawyer, I can talk to that, but there are other lists that are also relevant. And Shafak can talk to the lists that are applicable specifically in Turkey. On the US side, there are two major bodies that everyone has to think about when it comes to sanctions and export control. First one, the famous, everyone knows them, OFAC, Office of Foreign Assets Control. They've been around for a long time. It's not only after Russia that everyone is hearing from them. They've been around imposing sanctions against different countries and actors. They have 7 different lists. 7 different. The most important one, and everyone knows about that, is the SDN list. SDN list is especially designated national. What does it mean? If someone is added to that list, all their assets and interest in their assets has to be blocked by US persons mainly. There are some exceptions that others have to freeze as well in certain sanction programs, notably Iran, Cuba, and partially in North Korea program, where subsidiaries of US companies outside also have to follow US sanctions, but generally it imposes freezing obligation for US person. So that's one thing. On top of freezing, US has this ban on any engagement. So if someone is added to the list, not only you have to freeze as a US person, you have to make sure you are not dealing in any engagement with them. For example, if a US bank comes within the position of assets of a person who is somewhere else in the world and processing a USD transaction that comes for clearing in the US, if there is this name somewhere in that transaction, US bank has to look into that and see what's the role of that person. And if that person has assets or interest in asset in that transaction, they have to freeze that and report that within 10 days. that's important to understand that this is applicable to US persons because, in Turkey, we're going to see to what extent, what's the Turkish company's obligation to the SDN list. We talk about it later. But that was the most important list and the kind of death penalty in sanctions if you are on that SDN list. Then you have SSI list, you have foreign sanction evader list, you have correspondent account or payable to account sanction, which is capital list. You have non-SDN menu base, and you have this Chinese military industrial complex companies list. So just understanding what these lists are is a challenging thing. And unfortunately, what I've seen is many companies just turn on these lists in their screening without knowing what they are. We talk about, we'll cover how to approach all these lists before deciding to screen against them, but now I'm just going to cover them very quickly. The second agency I referred earlier is BIS, Bureau of Industry and Security. They have 4 lists of parties of concern. These are individuals and entities. You have denied person list, you have entity list, you have unverified list, and you have military and user list. These are populated with names of individuals and entities. When things get a bit complicated is the list of goods and items. Then you have the CCL in the US, commercial, that has all the names of this commerce control list that has all the names of goods and technologies that are controlled. These are basically dual use goods. Parenthesis, dual use good is a good that can have civil or military usage at the same time. And this list is a very long list filled with all these very technical description of items and that are dual use. If you have trouble sleeping, go look at this. Easily it makes you fall asleep because it's so long and complicated. You get lost like what it is. So then is it a sanctioned list? Yes or no? Historically, sanctioned lists are list of individuals and entities, but I guess after what happened in 2022 with Russia, now everyone has started to think about this BIS CCL list more and more. How do we incorporate that into our compliance? Does it even make sense if we screen against that? Because screening, how it works is matching a string in a transaction or a document you have against the string on that sanction screening, on that sanction list. Can you meaningfully screen that list of items against your transaction? Will those items be ever mentioned in a transaction? If yes, which field? Is it the free text field? Does it really make sense? Is it like a high quality comparison between the two strings? So these are all the questions we're going to talk about. And lastly, I hear more and more that there are people talking about another list, which is published by Department of Homeland Security, is Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act list. That's I wouldn't call that a sanctioned list, but it's again a list published by a US agency that has the name of entities that are in Xinjiang region of China and are allegedly using forced labor in their production. So as a US company, you have certain obligations toward that list. That's only the US. And then you have UK sanctions lists, and then you have EU sanction and all other countries. Shafak, can you talk about the lists from the Turkish government and the UN sanction list is applicable there because UN is Turkey is part of the UN, but it would be great, I guess, for the audience to know about.
Yeah. For the Turkish government, there is only one binding list of the UN list, and there are also some lists that has been recently published, which was actually for one nation, for Israel, which was which was announced by the Minister of Trade. There was no listing, but it told all the trade and the import and export by and between Israel. But okay. Amir, I want to ask you a question. How can the organizations effectively navigate international sanctions lists to ensure the compliance? Because it's too complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated. First of all, call Shafak and I. That's the first step. No, joking. Understand what the list is first. The most important thing. Please don't turn on a list without knowing what it is. it creates a lot of noise in your transaction monitoring or screening, as you call it, and makes you confused and frustrated, makes your business people frustrated because they hear no from compliance and legal saying no without knowing why. So first of all, understand these lists, to whom they apply, and what do they require. This to whom they apply is so important. Like, who is US person, who is non-US person, and to what extent non-US person should care about US lists? That's a very big question. There is always this aspect of transactions that are happening in a currency of the US that comes for clearing to the US. Therefore, you kind of causing a US person potentially to violate these sanctions. So understand all these jurisdictional nexuses you may have to US, UK, EU. And also on the other side, if you are a company, a subsidiary of a European company or American company in Turkey, you got to understand, how it works, the sanctions that are applicable in Turkey to you. If you're a subsidiary versus a branch, or maybe you just simply do online business from somewhere else in Turkey, you have to understand what's applicable to this. So that's the first step to think about. Then I think at this point, with all the complexities of sanctions, you're going to have dedicated people to be sitting all day and thinking about, okay, what are these sanction lists? What are the risks about sanctions and export control, and how we can mitigate them? It's becoming very complex. There was a time it could be a part-time, like a lawyer sitting in a company could do like, oh, I do sanctions too, but I think it's less and less viable. After 2022 and the imposition of massive sanctions against Russia, I think it's so important for organization to think about having dedicated, department to sanctions and export control. And lastly, as Shafak mentioned earlier, use of tools. It's almost impossible these days to be able to comply efficiently without using tools. And there are so many tools out there. It's important to understand what fits your needs best. Do you need a sophisticated sanction screening that has a case management and built into this? Yes or no? Or you're a small company, but you have cross-border transaction and you are highly dependent on US banks. Maybe you can do a smaller thing, use a smaller tool. Use of machine learning and AI, all these things now are evolving topics. How you can avoid the headache of false positive. What is false positive for people who may not know is, so screening, as I said, is a comparison between one string of text against another. Usually you don't do 100% matching. For example, if you do 100% matching, Amir with AMIR won't create a hit or stop a transaction if it's EMIR, because it's not 100% match. So that's why everyone started to use something called fuzzy logic, and there are different degrees of matching. So if you use fuzzy logic, it starts catching Amir and Amir as the same, because there are different versions of spelling this. So the bad thing about that, it's like a wide net. This starts to get things that are like, not really the hit that you want. So these are all false hits. And usually when there is a hit, a transaction shouldn't go through. The problem would be if you have a lot of false hits, a lot of your transactions that are totally legit won't go through, then you start losing business, and you start to frustrating your clients. You start to frustrate your business people who are going out there to bring business, and every time they have problem. So it's really that balance of how to bring down the false positive while actually catching whoever that is intended on that sanction list. And it's becoming impossible to do it without decent tools. And on top of this, and part of decent tools is good data. There are two sides to that. Making sure your data is clean whenever you enter a data of a client, making sure their name is spelled correctly, spaces, like, it's a big headache. How do you, like, deal with the spaces, making sure you have controls that remove spaces, for example, when you enter data, because later for screening, space matter. And making sure your data is refreshed periodically. If someone change their name, you gotta catch that to make sure your screening is meaningful. The other side of data is having decent, like, good versions of lists. Sanction lists are constantly updated. There was, like, in February, March, and April of 2022, we had hundreds of additions every day on the Russia sanctions program, making sure you work with a vendor or directly connected to these sanction authorities' websites through API or through manual connections to get the latest version very quickly. I think there is this acceptable delay in the industry. It varies based on industry, but once the sanction list is updated, you're going to quickly make sure that you have the updated list. And sometimes these lists, they just give you name, no identifying information. And how you leverage the information that is out there to kind of augment the quality of the sanction list. For example, there might be 500 Amir Fadavi in the world. How do you exactly spell as my name? How do you make sure you are catching the right Amir Fadavi? How do you do that? Use of date of birth, use of passport ID. Sometimes sanction authorities, they provide you with that, but sometimes they don't. How you make sure you work with the data provider that gives you accurate identifying information to avoid these false hits. It was a very long way of responding to your question, but because the question is very complex, I think these are the steps I would take. First, understanding what's applicable to me, understanding what a list require, and then use of dedicated people and tools to that.
Thank you, Amir. By means of the risk mitigation, what about the strategies can businesses employ to mitigate the risks associated with the sanctions?
So I think everyone wants to do business. No one wants to just not say no to things. However, because of these restrictions, because of sometimes not restriction, the reputational risk, there are certain opportunities that become more costly. And at the end of the day, the cost of doing that business is higher than the reward. And a rational business person, in that case, say, okay, I won't do that business. So making that balance of, okay, what I'm gaining, what I'm losing for business people is important. They have to say, okay, with whatever business opportunity, there is a risk. Is the risk more than what I gain? If yes, the business people have to reconsider that, because why do you bring this that is all cost to you with minimal gains? So that's a very business talk. I would leave that to the business people. But on the compliance and legal side, I think it's really important for business people to be proactive. If you want to bring a business that it's risky, bring it before going and advancing further to legal compliance, get clearances from internally, and make sure you don't push them in last minute. Hey, can you sign this? Can you clear this? I'm gonna sign a contract tomorrow. It won't work. Be proactive. Reach out to them, say, hey, I'm negotiating with these people. I think it's a good opportunity. And what do you think? And when you present a case to compliance and legal, sometimes it's external, sometimes it's internal, make sure you provide all the information. You say who they are, what's their risk. The more the more information you provide as business to compliance and legal, the easier it gets for them to analyze it. So being proactive and providing information, these are the main two things I would say as a business strategy.
Thank you very much, Amir. About the recent developments, I know that there are some AI tools and some new instruments to screen and monitoring the sanction list. But from your perspective, what recent developments or emerging trends in the sanctions policy should compliance professionals be aware of?
It's a moving topic. It's changing very fast. You see big names getting into compliance to leverage AI power to see how it works. I'm not aware of any cut-through tool that is doing that, but almost every major bank that we work with, they are exploring how they can use the power of AI in their sanction compliance and generally financial crime compliance to avoid these false positives and stopping things that shouldn't be stopped. Things like business reapplication. Like for example, if 5 times an analyst look at a transaction and based on those facts always decided the same and nothing has changed, can AI learn from that pattern and redo that again and again? So that's one example. The other thing is going out and finding data that is available online without human involvement and bring that data into the decision and present it easily in a very clean manner to the analyst so they can easily make that decision based on the data that they wouldn't otherwise find. These are 2 things that, for example, that I've seen. The other thing is how to keep on top of all these changes. Putting aside the tool development, probably the best that how fast everything has been changing in sanctions. We have new general licenses, we have new restrictions, we have new sanction person. It's a challenge to be on top of all these things. I think we all in this industry are following so many different sources, but I know, for example, Shafak has done this great job in making people posted on LinkedIn about changes. As simple as that, making sure you see that, you follow that. I do a weekly newsletter. You go see that. Making sure you are subscribed to alerts from regulators directly from the source. Imperfect, but that's how it is right now. Probably one day someone could come and clean all these sources together and through the use of technology, give a very clean feed daily to someone and say, okay, these are the things that, the developments that you have to be aware of. I'm not aware of any automatic way of doing this for now, but for now, really following I enjoy your firms LinkedIn things because it's okay, I don't have to worry and see things. It's there. I do this newsletter. I know a couple of people are very active in making sure they talk about sanction developments. So on the legal and regulatory developments, I would say now it's very, very manual, but making sure you follow these sources that I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. And about the DD, due diligence, what do you think about about the effective due diligence? How does it play a role in managing the potential sanctions-related risks?
Let's take a step back. If I'm a sanctioned person and I want to go around sanctions, what do? I try to convolute everything and muddy the water so no one can see I'm behind that. And we have this 50% rule on the sanctions, blocking sanctions on the US. If you are owned 50% or more by a sanctioned person, you are sanctioned by operation of law. It doesn't mean it doesn't require a designation, a separate designation. It's automatic. On the EU and UK side, there is ownership or control. To understand this control or this 50% ownership, you got to do due diligence. What does it mean? You got to understand who's behind that business. And believe me, whoever is sanctioned now is a master at this to make it hard for whoever to find they are behind this. I think as sanction imposing authorities have advanced in their, how they impose sanctions, whoever is sanctioned has also advanced in how to go around it. So that's how do we fix that is due diligence and sometimes enhanced due diligence. you gotta gather all the information, do whatever you can reasonably to find if a sanctioned person is behind that. And that has been the source of many enforcement actions in the US, that banks didn't do decent due diligence. A sanctioned person was behind that, and that information was reasonably discoverable, and no one did anything about it, and they got fined. So by not doing due diligence, it's a cost, I know. It slows things down, I know. But by not doing that, you expose yourself constantly to the risk of being fined, and probably like, less severe fine or more severe fine, reputational damage. So it's important for you, if you have a new client, if someone is reaching out with a very attractive, proposition to you, oh, I'm going to buy XYZ at a very good price, but you never worked with this counterpart before, you're going to ask questions. Hey, who are you? Who owns you? Who do you benefit from you? By the way, if you buy from these goods from me, do you keep them, or do you want to just like resell them to someone else? This is especially true right now with a lot of items that G7 is so concerned about when they go to Russia. That's common high priority item list. So want to pivot for a second, talk about that. These are basically, part of it started with, so the Ukrainian would go on the ground and see the drone parts, and they do reverse engineering and would find, okay, what's in this, and they would, follow the supply chain all the way back, okay, to see, okay, if this company in the US, like their component has been found there, they would ask them, okay, to whom you sold. They would say, we sold to this company in a European company. They would go to them, and then I would say, okay, to whom you sold. They would say, oh, we sold this company in the Middle East. And then they would say, oh, to whom you sold. They would say, oh, we sold it in the Caucasus. This way they would go through this. You don't want to go through this process without having decent due diligence documentations. If agency comes knock at your door and say, oh, to whom you sold, they say, oh, I don't know, like someone reached out to me or submitted an online order, be prepared for, further action. Like, no doubt, because it's so unreasonable now with, such a high risk product that everyone now knows that might be used in military purposes. You can't just say, oh, I sold it to this new counterpart that reached out to me. So you're going to make sure you ask who you are, with whom you work, how you're going to use my items, and you document everything. Imagine you do all these beautiful questions and you get responses, but you forgot to decently document that. If someone knocks at your door, you say, oh, I did this, swear to God, but I forgot to document. Would a regulator buy it? Probably no. So make sure you ask those questions. Many places started like, with questionnaires, and there is a balance that business would understand. Like business people and compliance legal people got to sit together to see, okay, what are the risks? What questions I need to mitigate that risk? And where do I stop? You don't want to annoy everyone with like questions that wouldn't add anything to the conversation. So the business say, okay, if you ask this compliance, what you get out of it? Would that change anything? If the answer is no, so probably don't even ask that question, because it creates like friction in the customer journey. You don't want that. So that reasonableness, asking questions that are relevant. I hate when I see some places ask whatever question that might not be even relevant. Even if you have the response to that, what does that change? Nothing. Remove that question from your due diligence, because that frustrates the client, slows the process, and wastes resources. Because if you have the information, you gotta process that. Okay, so make sure you have all the questions that will get you what's beneficial. And if you don't have that, insist on getting those information. Many places, they just like, I see clients or counterparts, they don't respond to questions, they respond selectively. Insist, if it's something that is important to you, insist on, hey, what are we going to do if someone hasn't responded? And be prepared in advance, like have procedures. If someone didn't answer to this, how we deal with that.
In contrary, I am also not happy with the over compliance of the banks. It is
Yeah.
also very common, very common.
So that's an interesting thing. I think banks are very scared because historically banks paid a lot of fines because first they have the deep pockets, and second they are highly regulated. They understand it, so they are the first target. But with the politics of the war and the history after, like, I think it started in mid 2010 with major sanction fines against banks, both US banks and European banks who were clearing in the US. Now, all these banks are so, like, they're saying this is really that risk for us. What do we gain from this? And what do we lose? They got to this kind of business decision of, oh, this is too risky. I'm not going to even touch it. How we can overcome that? By providing information that these banks need to process those transactions. Historically, they had hard time getting those questions because no one would give them to them. But if, as someone that is in a quote-unquote higher risk jurisdiction, proactively reaching out to this bank, say, okay, I'm doing this, and this is an opinion from Herdem Law Firm that analyzed everything and says everything is okay, there's a high chance that transaction is processed. Banks are a bit tired of doing everything by themselves, especially when it comes to export control, because they don't understand export control as much as exporters and manufacturers do, and it's so complex. You saw those lists. Like, it's like you got to be an engineer to understand what's happening there. Banks, they don't know. They don't have the resources, and I guess they are not supposed to know. Impossible for them to know. So, as exporters or manufacturer, make sure you provide that information to banks, make it easy for them to understand, and be ready to share information. And I always found that a way that you can make your transactions work with banks that are very conservative. Certain banks, they just got to find, they say, we completely want to avoid this. It's unfortunate, but understandable from risk point of view. But again, I think as compliance departments of banks maturing, they are more willing to take the quote unquote riskiest transaction because they have the resources to analyze that. And you can give them more information and make it easier for them to understand.
Thank you, Amir. Any questions from the audience? I think there is no question yet. We will be happy to answer the questions. And Amir, what do you think about the secondary sanctions risk? There are too many entities, especially in Turkey, who are afraid of the secondary sanctions risks by means of the Russian sanctions and the Iranian sanctions, as the territories close to Turkey and doing business with Turkey. So what will be your suggestions to them?
Turkey is one of the most challenging jurisdictions. Iran on one side, Russia, Syria. So kudos to all compliance people in Turkey, because the risk you are dealing with, it's probably the most challenging, and I would say the most fun intellectually. So what's the secondary sanction? I think the term secondary sanction is a loaded term politically. I would call it sanctionable activity as opposed to prohibited activity. So what is prohibited activity is an activity that a sanction imposing authority say to people over whom it has jurisdiction, you cannot do it, or you should, for example, do by freezing it. Sanctionable activity, on the other hand, is an activity that you as a person over whom sanction imposing authority has no authority says, if you engage in that activity, I may impose sanctions on you, which means I tell my people not to do business with you. Okay? And US does this, EU does this as well. I think there is this like image of, oh, you secondary sanctions or sanction of activity only is a US creature, but with Russia sanctions, we have clear examples of EU authorities telling non-EU persons, you may risk getting sanctioned by us if you engage in XYZ, if you like, continue working with certain things in Russia. The other one, for example, on the EU side is no Russia clause. Basically, you are telling someone outside of Europe through a contractual agreement of a European person what to do. So instead of secondary, I would say, hey, look at it this way. Is it prohibited or sanctionable? Prohibited, you need that direct jurisdiction, which is a US person or involving a US person through, for example, passing it through US financial system, quote unquote USD. Or in the absence of that nexus, is that activity something that the sanction imposing authority doesn't like for the goal of that sanction? Are you frustrating the goal of sanctions by doing something around it? Because then you may also get sanctioned. In the case of Iran, those, for example, who were going around the oil selling, the sale of oil in Iran, US said, okay, I'm sanctioning this, but you guys are going to go around it. I come after you as well. In case of Russia, I am making sure US, EU, G7 saying, okay, I want to make sure that these goods are not going there. But if you continue to fill the gap, I come after you as well. Doesn't matter where you are. And historically, you see in like, quote unquote, classic primary sanctions, there are always these designation grounds of support and material support. If you support someone who is sanctioned, wherever you are, you may become sanctioned yourself. So what's that? That isn't it the secondary sanction? So that's been around for a long time. So that's why I say, instead of like, thinking about secondary sanction, think about what is sanctionable. And to be honest, the risk for Turkey is high because first, sometimes there's this lack of understanding and communication. And second, the geography and all this trade relationship. So what businesses in Turkey can do, a lot of due diligence, a lot of documentations, and understanding even something is totally legal in Turkey may expose you to the risk of being sanctioned. Do you want that? Some people may say, okay, I'm totally fine with that. I managed to found a way that is totally secluded from the Western financial institutions, and I'm totally fine to be sanctioned. And be aware that if you're sanctioned, probably other Turkish banks won't work for you because they want to keep their access to global system. So it's ultimately a Turkish company's decision if they want to go that route. But make sure you analyze the activity to see whether this could be sanctioned, yes or no.
Thank you, Amir. Thank you very much for your insightful talk.
I saw a hand up in the participant earlier. I guess it was Fuad, but not anymore. So
yeah, and there's no question as well.
No question? Okay.
I want to conclude the session today, and thank you very much for joining us today, Amir, and hope we will gather in another session regarding the sanctions and the export controls very soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.